Let me start by thanking Jan Claybaugh, who has helped me a lot with this talk. So the usual caveats apply. All the opinions in here are mine, but I think any reasonable person will agree with me, so that we don't have to worry too much about that. So I'm here to talk to you about food. And food is an intensely personal and cultural issue to just about everybody. And food safety is certainly not an issue of political philosophy. No one wants unsafe food. I put up a couple of quotes here. Tell me what you are and I'll tell you what you eat. And I put one up about the British. The only reason they colonized the world was so that they could find a decent meal. Right now, the Centers for Disease Control says, and it's been saying for some time, that we have 76 million illnesses per year as a result of foodborne illness, and that results in 5,000 deaths. So my question is, what can we do about making a significant dent in those numbers and actually reducing those illnesses? This is a pretty widespread opinion. So you see a president saying there are certain things that only the government can do, and one of those things is ensuring that the foods we eat are safe and don't cause us harm. That is not an opinion that I think most people would disagree with. In fact, the previous commissioner under George Bush said nothing good in creating a healthier America through food and medical products will come to pass without the involvement of FDA. A somewhat stronger statement. I think this has been the prevailing opinion for over 100 years, and certainly it started around the 1880s. And between the 1880s and the turn of the 20th century, there was something like 100 bills to get the federal government involved in food safety. When it finally happened, one writer called it a dramatic expansion of the federal government's role in promoting the health and safety of the American consumer. So how did all that come about? Well, I think it was really these three men that had a great deal to do with it. The first is Sinclair Lewis, who went to work in a meat processing plant. He had planned to write an expose of the terrible working conditions of the meat packing plant. Instead, he ended up writing about food safety in his book, The Jungle, and that got the public tremendously aroused. Meanwhile, Harvey Wiley here was overworking in the Bureau of Chemistry and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and he was publishing papers on how food was adulterated. Teddy Kennedy didn't like either of these men. He considered Sinclair Lewis to be a crackpot and a socialist, which he was. He didn't like Harvey Wiley because he considered Harvey Wiley to be a showboater. In fact, Harvey Wiley was quite popular. He had a nickname in the American public. He was called Old Borax. So Teddy Roosevelt didn't actually believe Sinclair Lewis's account. He sent his own men into the meat packing plants. They found exactly what Lewis found, was that rats were running freely over meat, in some cases, ended up being part of meat. And so that convinced Roosevelt to sign the first food safety bill, which was the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. And as one writer put it, the agency was created at the peak of organized fervor for reform. In fact, one could argue that Rachel Carson's Silent Spring had a similar effect on EPA. So what happened in those early years? Well, there were sort of several kinds of problems and some fairly easy solutions. The first was, as Lewis identified, there were filthy, pest-ridden plants. And as Harvey Wiley identified, there were adulterants. I thought that's actually a real thing today. But they were pretty terrible. Lead salts were added to candy and cheese. Textile inks were used as coloring agents. Brick dust was used as an additive to cocoa. And the list of adulterants was pretty long and pretty nasty. In addition to that, we had problems with pathogens, small invisible bugs. In 1864, Louis Pasteur discovered not only were these invisible bugs making people sick, but he discovered a really magical cure. All you had to do was heat the product, and it got rid of those nasty bugs. And he applied it originally to wine, but the real problem was milk. Back around the turn of the 20th century, 1 in 4 cases of foodborne disease was due to unpasteurized milk. However, pasteurization was not widely accepted at the time. Some people thought that the problem with milk was thunderstorms. Thunderstorms caused it to spoil. Others thought that if you heated milk, it would cause you to get scurvy. So, what do these three things have in common? Around that time, there were dirty, pest-ridden plants. There was intentional addition of relatively bad stuff to food, and we had a nice fix for pathogens, a very easy thing, heat treatment. What they have in common is that they're all relatively simple, and the fixes were pretty obvious. And sure enough, FDA moved forward and had some considerable success in solving these problems. And these are just three of some of the more successful regulations. The first came out of the 1923 Pasteurized Milk Ordinance, which requires milk to be pasteurized. Solved the problem. In the 1960s, we again had a problem with pathogens in low-acid canned foods. Low-acid canned food regulations basically, again, required pasteurization, more or less solved the problem. We had sanitary procedures and good manufacturing practices that solved a huge part of the problems with pathogens. Certainly not all. As I said, we still have 76 million illnesses. But these were the three big successes that FDA had. However, no organization is successful forever. That's kind of everybody in business knows that, unless in fact they transform themselves. During FDA's period of growth over the 100 years between 1900 and 2000, Fortune 500 magazine reported that of the top 500 firms in 1900, only one remained in 2000. That's not counting regulatory agencies, that's private firms. That firm was General Electric, who greatly decentralized and changed the way they did business. And what I want to argue today, to begin with, is that FDA has suffered from what I'm going to call diminishing regulatory effectiveness. And by that, I mean they are not reducing food safety risk with their current approach. And I want to argue that that's due to three reasons: organizational, scientific, and institutional. So, how about organizational? There's a great deal of evidence that shows over time firms began to calcify. That they, and this writer Marvin Bernstein wrote in the 1950s, talking about commissions, which are the same as regulatory agencies more or less. Complacency and inertia appear as inevitable developments in the life cycle of a commission. It's not surprising that this should happen to FDA. In point of fact, FDA is generally not held accountable for success the way that private firms are. And private firms, by being held responsible for success through markets, still don't survive. In fact, something like less than 0.1% make it to 40 years. FDA is now 2.5 times that old. So organization appears to be a problem. How about institutions? Over time, we see informal relationships build up with regulatory agencies. This is certainly true of FDA. Regulated industry tends to want a certain kind of regulation, which are generally command and control regulations, and tend to get them. Over time, we also see that we get what's called the bootlegger and Baptist type of phenomenon, where we have a regulated industry and food activists essentially wanting the same thing. These informal rules and relationships tend to grow over time, and in fact, there's some evidence that there's increasing returns from investing in this sort of rent-seeking. And so that you would expect that over time, this would become more, these institutional relationships would become more fixed with FDA. And finally, scientific. After pasteurization, there have not been a great deal of magic bullets. I would argue that irradiation was one, but we lost irradiation, and I'll talk about that later. The problem is, now it's hard, the problems have become more complex, they're less certain, and the fixes are less obvious, and in many cases much more expensive. So, for all these reasons, FDA has been less efficient. However, in the 1990s, FDA, with some renewed enthusiasm, said it's time to tackle this problem of 76 million illnesses and 5,000 deaths. And they put out a number of rules, but these are three of the most significant. And the first, and I would argue probably the most significant one, was FDA looked at the seafood industry. And the seafood industry did have a problem with foodborne illness. And at the behest of large seafood processors, they began a program. They began writing a regulation. Initially, it was a voluntary regulation. It was to help seafood processors who wanted to export to Europe to continue to export. Over time, however, the industry said, wait a minute, we don't want a voluntary program. We want everybody to have to comply with these rules. So the problem was made mandatory. There was now then a mandatory regulation. The problem with seafood HACCP was, and this is called HACCP, Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points, was that it didn't work. Most of the problems in seafood are with raw shellfish. If you take a raw product out of the water, it's already contaminated, goes right to the restaurant, and somebody consumes it raw. There's really nothing in the process, there's no processing in order to control the risk. And in fact, there hasn't been much in the way of risk reduction for seafood. The second one, they applied the same concept as process controls to juice products. There was a problem with juice products, again, unpasteurized juice. FDA put out a requirement for a warning label, which pretty much solved the problem. Juice processors either stopped making juice or they pasteurized it. Okay, going back to our magic fix. Nevertheless, FDA went forward and put a very large rule together for processing controls. The last one, most recent one, I would argue perhaps one that is most illustrative, is a rule for dietary supplement with manufacturing practices. Here was a case where Congress said, FDA, you can regulate how these dietary supplements are made. You don't have to, but you can if you find a problem. FDA looked for a problem, literally could not find a systemic problem. In fact, if you look at the cost-benefit analysis, you'll see that the costs were $100 to $300 million per year, this 100 pages of codified language, and the benefits were 8 to 64 million. Again, there's some evidence that some parts of the industry wanted it. Certainly the drug industry supported the approach of more extensive food manufacturing practices who were more like drugs than like foods. So, the point is, here we had a problem that wasn't solved, here was a problem that was solved pretty quickly without the rule, and here's a problem that didn't have, here's an issue that didn't have a problem to be solved. So what we have is rules that aren't terribly effective. Here are the empirical results. Although this is basically the change in illnesses and outbreaks, although it looks like there's a spike in illnesses in the mid-1990s, again, that was from FDA increasing monitoring. So they were able to pick up more of the smaller outbreaks. But in general, what you see, if you look at all pathogens is, frankly, over this time period, there hasn't been a lot of change. So a lot of investment, a lot of rules, and not much of a change in the way of food safety. Unfortunately, that is not what the public thinks. The public thinks that food safety, that food is becoming much more dangerous. The reason? The media's gotten interested in this. Okay, so the number of media reports on food safety has gone up dramatically. And what does that do? That puts pressure on Congress to give the agency more authority, more resources, and it puts pressure on the FDA to keep doing something. So the perception of food safety is not actually matching the record of food safety. So, what is that? Why is FDA not being efficient, other than for the reasons that I suggested? The first is, I would suggest that since 1906, when FDA first began to regulate the food industry, it's become much more complicated. As one author put it, no period of time has seen such rapid advances in food and beverage processing as the 20th century. So we're seeing all kinds of new technologies like quick freezing, sous vide, packaging, and many more things. So combinations of foods, processes, and packages that are literally would take an enormous amount of information to understand and to be able to pass regulations that would actually address problems. Remember, supermarkets have something like 30,000 items in them. And we're asking this small agency to have expertise in all of these items. It's an incredibly diverse industry, incredibly complicated. But that's only half the problem. This is a bigger problem, in my mind. If you look at the universe of firms that FDA is charged with overseeing, in conjunction with the states, I should add, the numbers are enormous, okay? So just domestic food manufacturing facilities, that would include warehouses and so forth, 136,000. And approximately 50,000 food manufacturing firms, domestic. Cosmetics, enormous number. Restaurants, almost 1 million restaurants in this country. Many of those are inspected by state and local governments, however. Supermarkets and grocery stores, over 100,000. Produce farms, domestic, 184,000. And 96,000 egg farms. And then they have the problems of exports. We have something like nearly 200,000 foreign firms who are exporting to the U.S. Again, FDA has responsibility in some fashion for all of these things. So the question you ask yourself was, what are they doing about that? Well, the Inspector General looked at it, and he said, over a 2-year period, over half of the firms were not inspected at all. Not one inspection from FDA. Of the rest, 14 were inspected a single time, and the remaining 30% were inspected 2 or more times. Well, so suppose we say that there are, just looking at the food manufacturers, there's 50,000 food manufacturers, and suppose we wanted to inspect them, say, once a week. Maybe that would make a difference. FDA would have to go from its current 5,700 inspections per year to 2.5 million inspections per year. Is anybody envisioning that kind of increase in the budget for FDA? So that's, and again, that's just food production facilities. Those people who are in food safety know that you can't sample your way to safety in terms of microbial pathogens. Why isn't the same true of inspections? Can we sample our way to safety? And I would argue probably not. Nevertheless, FDA is still pursuing the course of regulations for this incredibly complex industry and inspections, and thinking that that's going to get us there. An additional problem is, what do you inspect for? FDA has been passing regulations for about 100 years now. Virtually none of them have ever been taken off the books. Which ones are important? Generally, they're treated as all important. Well, it's not just FDA. And this problem, I think, goes throughout many of the regulatory agencies. Here's the former director of the Division of Enforcement in the Securities and Exchange Commission, Richard Sauer. So poorly do governments understand the entities they regulate, they can sometimes be confounded by even thinly disguised frauds. And everybody said, well, the SEC should have been more on top of all. Perhaps. But I don't know. I don't know the securities industry. Maybe it's really, really complex. Maybe it's just not going to be possible. How about OSHA? Adam Finkel, who used to work at OSHA, said at the current rate of health inspections, it would take OSHA more than about 600 more years to make any chemical exposure measurements at half of the nation's industrial facilities that handle hazardous substances. So it's not just FDA that has this problem of knowing enough about the industry to pass intelligent regulations and having enough inspection resources to make a difference. Well, perhaps it's because we haven't given FDA enough money. Maybe that's the problem. Well, not really. In the period I'm thinking about, 1997 to 2006, 2 years, FDA's budget was more than doubled. Again, we didn't have hardly any change in our rates of food safety, but we more than doubled the budget for FDA. So that doesn't seem like that's the problem. However, Mercatus does economics, so I have to talk about economics now for a few minutes. Economists will say that's all very well and good, that FDA hasn't been effective, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't keep doing what they're doing, because food safety is a market failure. And I would argue historically that is absolutely the case. When FDA was first created, and really up to the 1950s and 60s, food safety was one of those things that you got sick. You couldn't tell exactly what it was that made you sick. In fact, the symptoms for foodborne illness was a lot like flu. And even if you could tell that it was from food, you could very rarely trace it back to the plant that made you sick. In fact, I used to work in the restaurant industry, and we were called judgment proof. They said, unless you're going to make everybody in the restaurant sick, don't worry about it too much. Serve the meat. But in order for this market failure to occur, I would argue there are three conditions that have to exist. First of all, you can't trace it back. As you said, if you can't ever trace it back to the offending firm, they're okay, right? So you can't have tracebacks. The second thing is, if those firms that want to take better care can't really have any way to signal the fact that they have better practices other than other firms. And finally, consumers just simply have to be unaware of all of this. All these things have to happen if you're going to have a market failure. And I argue that, in point of fact, most of these things, this was the case. For most of the 20th century, this was the case. Clearly, food safety constituted a market failure. Okay, it was an information failure. Consumers didn't know enough to know how to allocate their purchases. What's changed? We're getting better at tracebacks. We're getting much better at tracebacks. We're getting much better at epidemiology. The federal government, the FDA, USDA, and CDC is running a wonderful program called PulseNet. And what does PulseNet do? PulseNet actually tracks and keeps records of fingerprints for pathogens. What are those? Every living organism has DNA, and that DNA has like a fingerprint. And we have this new field called pulse field gel electrophoresis. It's easy for me to say. PFGE. And what that does is, if you have somebody who made sick, you can actually take the fingerprint of the pathogen that made them sick. If you can trace this back, you can look at the contaminated food, see if that fingerprint matches the pathogen in the contaminated food. If they match, there's no question where that problem came from. This is a growing technology. It's very exciting. In addition to that, to help tracebacks, now we have a number of interesting things. Originally, it was barcodes. We still have barcodes on a lot of foods that help trace back. Now we have these radio frequency identification tags, again, helping with traceback. So traceback is becoming the thing. So what's happening is we are getting much better at tracing problems back to their source. It doesn't have to be that we trace everything back to the source. All we have to do is have a high enough probability so that firms are now concerned. They're concerned enough to take care in case they create a problem and it's traced back to them. And so that's being said. How about signaling? It used to be common to say, well, there's no way for food manufacturers to signal to consumers that their processing is better because consumers don't understand processing. That's exactly right. So what? That's not really the issue. The issue is, if you have an excellent food safety program, who do you have to signal to? In today's world, you have to signal to those that you buy from. So if you are, for example, an ingredient manufacturer, you signal up to whoever the food processor is that's buying your ingredients. They actually inspect you. You have a contract with them. And there's a lot going on about this. We'll talk about it. How about retailers? Walmart inspects. Walmart has their own set of contracts. Walmart inspects. Insurance agencies. Now that you know you can be liable for some of these problems, food manufacturers have gone out, they've hired insurance companies to protect themselves. Well, the insurance companies are inspecting. They want to know that you're doing what you're supposed to do. How about consumers? Absolutely. There's been a huge rise in third parties who are going out and providing consumers with information about what's going on. Certainly, as I said before, the press is much more interested in this. You get a lot more reporting from consumers about who's producing problems. The most interesting thing to me is the RSS feeds. For those of you that don't know what these are automatic feeds that you can get. And you can get a feed that tells you when there's a food safety outbreak, what food it is, what caused it, and that tells you whether or not you want to buy that food. Interestingly, if you go on those websites, a couple of pieces of information are on there that I find quite interesting. One is their personal injury lawyers who are advertising on those sites. So it's not enough to you just know you can avoid food. Now you know who to call to sue these people. Not only that, you've got other firms who have substitute foods who are advertising and say, oh, and incidentally, I sell the same product and I don't have the problem. Okay? This is really the market working quite well. So as reported in Dan Klein's excellent book, The Half-Life of Policy Rationales, one of the authors, Morehouse, says, if a lack of information is a major justification for government consumer protection, the case for government intervention may be seriously weakened by the dramatic increase in the availability of consumer information on the internet. Technology makes low-cost, up-to-date information readily available to consumers. Well, this is actually an entirely new phenomenon. Let's go back to Harvey Wiley, okay, the guy who was the FDA's first commissioner. He worked at FDA until 1912, then he quit. And he went out and he became a third-party supplier of information. Old Borax went to work for Good Housekeeping, and he kept doing the same thing he was doing. He was supplying consumers with information on adulterants in Good Housekeeping magazine. And in fact, as you see, women wept when he quit. He was quite popular. Okay, so now we have these sort of market failures disappearing, basically. They're still going to always be with us to some extent, but they're certainly less of a problem. What does the market do with that information? Well, as Steckbeck and Becky have written, what used to be a market failure is now a market opportunity for firms. In fact, they cite an example in their book about market failures turning into market opportunities. Most people, probably 20 years ago, couldn't imagine buying something over the internet, unseen from anybody, somebody you didn't know. You'd have to buy it. It was a one-time purchase. You'd never see them again. That seems like a kind of a market no market could possibly develop. And yet, what have we seen with e-commerce? Places like eBay. We see millions and millions of purchases. Something like 0.4% of the people that buy off eBay are disappointed with their purchase. So a market failure turned into a market opportunity. What has the private industry done with those opportunities? They've created their own standards. Okay, there are now millions of food safety contracts, and they are different than public standards, and they have some incredible advantages over public standards, that is, regulations. First of all, they're quicker. They can respond quicker to changes. So, for example, where FDA might look at a problem for 4 to 8 years to go from proposal to final rule, these people can change their contracts in a matter of days if they wish. They're often more stringent than the public standards. I think one thing that's kind of interesting is they become de facto mandatory. If you want to sell your product, you're going to have to sign these private contracts, and in addition, subject yourself to private inspections. Okay? They're clearer, they are beginning to include traceability, and clearly the industry has the ability to enforce these things, unlike FDA. Okay, those 2.5 million inspections, they're actually being done in the private sector. Okay, in fact, what's happening is some food companies are complaining there's too many inspections, too many different kinds of contracts. I think that's a great thing. Hopefully the market will drive the better ones. Nevertheless, what we have now is we have private industry with private contracts more extensive contracts, lots of monitoring, vastly in excess of what FDA does. So one question that we should ask ourselves is, going back to the original quotes, is it really the Food and Drug Administration? Is it really the government that's keeping food safe right now? I would argue in general it's not. It really is the private standards overall. Not to say that FDA doesn't have a role, and I will get to that. So who's doing this? Everybody. Supermarkets are doing it, upstream buyers are doing it, trade organizations are doing it, third parties are doing it. There are absolutely millions of these things, and this is just gives you some examples. McDonald's is doing it, Walmart is doing it. Everybody is establishing these private standards. Everybody is inspecting. Okay, a lot more than FDA. How do agencies feel about private standards? Well, I don't want to mention FDA specifically because I don't have any quotes from them except for last Friday's one. Codex Alimentarius Commission is an international commission that sets food standards. They're not all that happy with this. Within Codex, significant anxiety has been expressed that the rapid pervadation of private food safety standards is serving to undermine the Commission's role. So the status quo is being questioned, and I don't think they're likely to give up this power easily. My view is that the people who wrote this, perhaps in Codex or not, are taking the wrong view. They should not look at this as a threat, but as an opportunity. But where are we going? With this, now we have sort of diminishing regulatory effectiveness. We have this larger, sort of more complex world to regulate. Okay, many more firms to oversee. What is the modern approach to solving these problems? The modern approach is to do more. Let's do more regulations. Let's do more inspections. Let's have more FDA authority, and particularly let's have top-down driven. Okay, let's put FDA in charge. Okay, FDA passes the regulations. Those regulations then go down and enforced by states, they're enforced by localities. In fact, we'll even ask industry to enforce them and send all the results back up to FDA. In point of fact, they suggest that FDA should empower state governments, which is sort of interesting from a federalism perspective. But I think if FDA empowers state governments by taking on more power themselves, that seems to not quite work. But that's the modern approach. Do more. More regulations, more inspections, more top-down kinds of approach. Will it work? I want to argue that it won't, for a number of reasons, most of which I've discussed before. First of all, it's a very complex industry. I think one-size-fits-all regulation is going to get harder and harder to make any sense. Second of all, we still have the political problem. As long as FDA has these policies, people are going to seek to get policies that are advantageous to them and disadvantageous to the people that they compete with. In many cases, if these solutions don't work, as I suggested some don't, they may actually crowd industry out from providing solutions that might work. Then we have the problem simply of too many rules. Which ones are important, which ones aren't. Harder and harder for FDA to inspect. I don't know what the incentive would be for private industry to report private inspections, the results of those up to FDA, so I'm not sure that that would help. And finally, again, this sort of complex world. So I want to argue that the modern approach is not the way to go. So now let me get to the good stuff. What do I think they ought to be doing? Focus on science. Go back to what FDA is good at, which is science. I think as long as FDA is a policy-focused agency, that actually detracts from them finding scientific solutions. One, these decisions take years to make, and things are moving too quickly to take years to find solutions. The other is, FDA has a wonderful cadre of great scientists. These scientists should be unleashed to go and innovate and find solutions. However, as long as you're a policy-focused agency, scientists are forced to work within the existing policy constraints. They are not, certainly not encouraged to go say, well, here's an existing FDA policy, let me go work and find something better, okay? If you moved away from being a policy-focused agency that frees scientists up to do what they do best, which is to discover truth. In fact, the way scientists think about truth is there is no such thing as absolute truth. There's always going to be new science, which might lead to new solutions. It's always moving. Remember, a regulation is fixed. It's static. Once you put it in place, it stays there forever. Science doesn't work that way. Science is constantly looking for new solutions. In fact, some of the regulations are outmoded by the time that they're finished. Again, if you were not focused on policy, then that also gets rid of the political component of policies. FDA needs to reorganize. They need to become more like a 21st century organization. As I mentioned, GE decentralized. We're seeing that in lots of organizations. If you were decentralized, you give scientists more sort of control over discovering solutions. I think that would be extremely helpful. You won't find a lot of organizations now who have a very top level saying, we're going to make the large investments, we know what's best to do, we're going to stick with those for several years. What you find is organizations making many different kinds of investments and seeing which ones will pay off. This is the kind of thing that FDA needs to reorganize to do. Well, if they did that, and I'm not suggesting that would be easy, in fact it would take probably oversight by Congress. Instead of ignoring or treating private contracts as though they were a threat, they could actually enhance private contracts. If FDA went out and found solutions to problems, private contracts would be forced to pick these up because in order to be competitive, you cannot afford to ignore a solution that works. That's important. You can't afford to ignore. So, and we said these things become mandatory. In fact, any solutions out there that work in de facto become mandatory. They can be enacted quickly. I have anecdotal evidence that if FDA finds something and they actually put it on the web, contracts all over the country pick this up. They can be enacted quickly. What's more, they can change quickly. Okay? When that's out of date, you just adopt something else. And not everybody has to enact it. If the solution doesn't apply to your product, your process, your packaging, you don't have to take it up. This seems to me to be, in today's world, fast-moving world, a much better way to solve food safety problems than to go with regulation and inspection. What else? Third suggestion, whoops. Plug in or find another power source. I need some help here. This seems to have died on me. That's all right. Well, I'll skip the slide and just move on to the next one. What else can FDA do? I mentioned that we lost irradiation. I believe that because people were able to tie irradiation to Three Mile Island and Hiroshima, which was completely ridiculous, sort of a flat earth kind of approach, that we perhaps lost the opportunity to prevent hundreds of thousands of illnesses and perhaps save some deaths. FDA can invest more in trying to approve new technology. Some of these things that might turn out to be magic bullets. That work? Okay. So you see it? I have my picture of the atom bomb there and radiation. And what are some of these new technologies? There's really fascinating, interesting stuff coming in genetic modification and nanotechnology. Just one example, nanotechnology, new food packages that actually alert consumers to when the food is spoiling. And perhaps even better, are actually able to spray some sort of antibiotics into the food and prevent it from spoiling. FDA can invest more in getting these technologies approved rapidly when it makes sense, can invest more in investigating both the risks and the benefits of these technologies, and let consumers know. Take more of an activist role in letting consumers know this works, much more so than they did with irradiation. We have 30 years of really good science on risk communication. FDA should take advantage of that and should actually actively be working to get these technologies that actually have some chances of reducing foodborne disease accepted. Last, when I came into FDA, I was told we are cops. FDA is the food cop, and I don't think they can give up being food cops. There will always be people outside of this system of contracts and inspection. There will always be people at the fringe who absolutely FDA needs to go after. And I would argue that for the yucky guys, FDA needs to continue to enforce the rules against them. I think it's a much smaller set, however, than the one that FDA is currently trying to inspect. But definitely have to keep going after the bad actors. And part of the reason they have to do that is when you have a bad actor, like say, if you have one bad spinach farm, it affects all spinach. And everybody knows that, so nobody wants the bad actors to stay in their place. So, in summary, FDA is, right now, I would argue, somewhat like Minister Sukhaminov, if I pronounce that right, in the events of August. And he was the Minister of War in World War II, and he insisted he could fight World War II with World War I tactics and equipment. FDA is still trying to fight the food safety problems with literally early 20th century tools. They've been doing the same thing for 104 years. It's time to change. And I think that's the only way we're going to make any improvements in food safety. I'll stop there.